Up next, we will be discussing Nagios monitoring of Netezza databases here with Frank Pantaleo. He is a BIDW consultant for Brightlight. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Frank.
Thank you. This is, so as he said, this is my presentation for monitoring Netezza database with Nagios. Throughout the presentation, I make a lot of references to Nagios, and all of it is for core. I did use XI a little bit, but I just wanted to make that as a side note here. My email address here is here in the presentation, which will be available online with the rest of them. So if you need to contact me, it's there. So just wanted to kind of like roll through some of the things that I'm going to be talking about is oops, see if I can get this right here. Oh, good. So we've got a couple of W's. The state of monitoring for Netezza, monitoring Netezza database with Nagios, and future direction. And the reason why I like this kind of couple W's is it seems to me I've always, with my kids, there was always like this thing about the who, what, where, and when of things. So that kind of like was what kind of triggered my thought on that was, okay, so for why are we monitoring for Netezza? Okay, so for every business is very dependent on IT services now. Oops. Okay, I don't need that. So every business is very dependent on IT services now. Everything from word processing running over the network to databases that allow them to maintain better relationships with their customers. For larger operations like the Chicago Board of Trade, it would be impossible to imagine them reverting to electronic tracking of trades back to paper. Banks, hospitals, governments, businesses of any size are very reliant on their computer systems to keep them running. If computers aren't running, in some cases, the businesses just can't function. So for example, I was even talking about hospitals there. I can't even imagine how integrated IT is in hospitals right now. You know, really, to some extent, in those businesses, there's a case of life and death in some instances. When IT people are doing their job and making sure everything is up and running 24/7, everyone else can do their job more efficiently. In a case like Amazon, was talking about outages here, and actually Ethan made some references here. There's a Gartner reference in there for 42,000. The other thing that I've talked about going to a cloud level is Amazon, where they lost about $5 million being down for one hour of time. So we can see here that the stakes are fairly high in terms of making sure that things are up. So in some cases, monitoring allows us not only to be proactive, but reactive as well. If I can tell my CTO how much space CDW has grown over the past year, he can take that information and use it as evidence to purchase more hardware and software. For example, when am I going to run out of space for my EDW? How has my EDW processing exceeded CPU and file space for the servers? Okay, so what kind of monitor are we looking for? A universal. Can it monitor everything? Databases, servers, operating systems, hubs, applications. Is it efficient? Does it allow my staff to know if someone is currently working on that ticket by another person? Is it web enabled? Can it show the state of my whole enterprise in one, like in a summary page? And actually there were some references that Ethan made when they were talking about some of the advanced features of the tool. So for escalation, is there a list that can be addressed the first time only? And if not, is the alert met during a certain time frame? In other words, an SLA, is there a second and tertiary alerts of people that can be contacted? Is it distributed? Is the monitoring software HA aware? Is another kind of like side piece of distributed. If the hub doesn't allow monitoring software to talk to a sensor, what happens? Reporting. Can I tell how often services have gone down? Can I tell how long it takes from notification to resolution to resolve an issue? Is it external? Are references to the tool external such that I can contact it by an existing application? How long would it take to integrate without doing a complete rewrite of a piece of software? Is it open source or commercial? Can I get support if the monitoring is broken? Monitoring solution is broken. Okay, so the state of monitoring. There is an event monitor built into Netezza, And I'm going to go into a little bit more into what are some of the things that it offers, but it's about 34 events. So currently in Netezza 7.1, IBM has made the ticketing process a lot easier, such that when an event occurs, they can actually create a ticket automatically. So I can take any of the events in Netezza that are in there and have it do that, but only the events that are in there, nothing custom. Netezza portal can be run on a secondary server, so that's the second offering. It can be run on either the database or the secondary server. Commercial offerings, Brightlight Consulting, which is who I work for, offers a tool called Observation Deck, which allows you to look at the Netezza history database and allows you to get some KPIs out of that database. The information is stored in the cloud and allows our customers to review that information. Okay, so to get a little bit more about the Netezza and the 34 alerts, there's a tool called NPS that allows you to manipulate some of the actions of the database when those events happen. So these are some examples of what it can do, only two things actually. One is email, and the other one is script execution. So the downside of the tool is that email only occurs once for the event, and you never know if somebody's actually working on that physical problem. So in my mind, it becomes a big issue. And there's no escalation if there's an actual problem, so you don't get a secondary or third list. Script execution is an option. So one possibility they give as an example, actually besides tying into SNMP, which I'm going to get into later, is that you can actually do kill sessions in Netezza through when an event happens in the database. Okay, so excuse me. And again, in Netezza 7.1, we can do auto creation of tickets. And here's some examples of stock, of Netezza 7.1 stock alerts. So disk full, spoof full, hardware failed, and there's other things here about temperature and other things, and you can read that at your leisure. Okay, so for Netezza portal, what I like to call the fog solution, or face on glass. So it's that type of monitoring. And if you want to be glued to your seat in order to capture issues, in order to get an event, this could potentially be a solution for you. That's a joke, by the way. Custom queries can be added to the web-based tool so long as the information you want to look for is captured in the dictionary. So if it happens outside, you've got a problem. Where you've got, on the other hand, you've got something like Nagios. It can do monitoring of the file system and other things like that, and other secondary pieces that are involved in your database. So there's a lot more you can get out of a tool like that. So all queries supplied in custom can be viewed as charts or numeric information. But the downside of this tool is that there's nothing that tells you what's bad or good. It's just some information that says, here's something that's happening. Okay, so, and the other thing is that the tool has no alerting capability at all, and it can be used as a way to access all the features of the Windows version of this Netezza portal, which is called NPS. And so those are all accessible on the web. So you can do session killing and creation of some objects and creation of users. So there's some things in there. The portal is not LDAP aware, where Netezza can actually be either LDAP aware or not LDAP aware based on the configuration. So the password that you have an entrance to the tool is static if you're using LDAP. And then, but if your database is LDAP enabled, then once you get in there, you can add your databases and then add your usernames and passwords, and then access the database through that portal using your LDAP passwords and usernames. Okay, so what are we monitoring for? What am I monitoring for in my Netezza database? Are we contending for resources in the database? For example, table locks and latches. Actually, latches is Oracle, sorry. User queries exceed SLA times for the EDW. Age of a backup is older than SLA times that we've agreed to. Is the LDAP server available in our case, since we are using LDAP? Is the spoof space balanced? If the spoof space is unbalanced in Netezza, the thing is, and you said you weren't familiar with parallel databases. The thing is, with parallel databases, the way that happens is you've got space laid out and you've got your table that occurs across several disks. And if you've got one spoof that's full, it doesn't matter if everything else is empty. as in terms of distribution, and it considers the database full, even if one is full. It's kind of give you some picture that how that whole thing works for parallel databases. Okay, so late arrival of files for EDW processing. In order to make our daily SLA times, we need to have files in by a certain time, and we have an event for that. Okay, so architecture options. So we had a couple of possibilities here. We can have sensors live on the database server, or we can have sensors live on the Nagios server. There's kind of like up and down sides to both. So for sensors living on the Nagios server, we had to use ODBC, and in my case, since I was using Perl, so it would be using either the Perl DBI, and the other option is using Netezza CLI, which is a command line option. Now, the upside of using Netezza CLIs is that you can't actually encrypt passwords on the file system, so they're not visible. So there was some possibility there. But the thing that I like using personally about using Perl is that you have the ability to interact with it, and you can do some things with the SQL and analyze the results that says they come back from the database. So that's kind of like why I went in that direction. Now, so the other option is to have the sensors live on the database server. And in order to use that, we use an option called NRPE, which I'll get a little bit into later, but basically allows you to have a channel to talk to your remote servers and execute commands. I have elected to use NRPE in using no parameters, which is an option for NRPE. It's the default option. And anything else is considered a possible gap in security according to the NRPE instructions. So this is why I went that direction. And I had the option of using Perl or Bash or Java or anything like that. I chose mostly Bash and Perl for my operation. And the reason why that is because it has an API that allows me to talk using SQL to the database with very little effort. DBI is a mainstream way for Perl to talk to ANSI SQL databases. Okay. Okay, so this is kind of like a deep dive a little bit more into what happens on the passive side, but this also to some extent exposes you to what you need to do in order to if you actually need to set up an SNMP side of which is the passive side of Netezza monitoring. So so for passive, we have SNMP as an option, and what happens here is in order to make that thing work, you have to do configuration on the server side. Excuse me. So you have to do configuration on Nagios server, and you have to do configuration on Netezza side. So basically what happens is that you've got pieces on Nagios in order to do SNMP trap capturing. And in this case, what happens is that there's pieces that you have to enable from the Netezza events that allow the database to actually invoke those SNMP agent and then talk to the Nagios in order to set those things up. Okay, so to kind of give you a little bit of a taste of what happens from an architecture perspective, is that you kind of like actually have to think of this as not just one box, but potentially several boxes, because this is just one Netezza server in this case. But this could be your whole architecture actually for everything that you do that's passive monitoring. And then what happens is that back on your Nagios server, you have an SNMP drap daemon which captures the SNMP alerts. And then you have an SNMP trap translation, which then routes it back up to Nagios for alerting. Okay, so I have Spider-Man on here, and you'll have to see if you can figure out why. But let's see. Okay, so for active alerts, it requires Perl and NRPE to be installed on the Netezza server. NRPE allows the remote server to execute shell scripts in response to a request from the Nagios server. Got to remember, the end goal is communication of a state. So the web dashboard is the one that has all that information, and it has to be able to communicate and understand, not only execute a command remotely, but get that state information back. And NRPE is the conduit for that information. In my case, since we were using the remote option. Queries can be done over ODBC, But in doing so, I was violating a rule of not exposing usernames and passwords in script. So this is why I went further into using a package which is Netezza has called SQLPM, which is similar in some ways to DBI, but also different. Okay. Okay, so this right here is kind of gives you a general picture of what's happening from a whole. This is not only active, this is passive. But you've got here your active checks that are going on to the database server. And actually, to some extent, you may have passive as well. But this is kind of giving you a good idea of what's happening on your network, because you may have different things that are happening, both on the passive side and then on the active side. And then you've got Nagios, which is sitting here in the middle analyzing all these things, and then is used for display, mail, and pages. And then you've got your central monitoring tool for looking at things. Okay. So, did anybody get the Spider-Man reference, by the way? Okay, so just to kind of give you a little background there, the reason why I put Spider-Man was because Spider-Man is just, as you probably all well know by now, is Spider-Man with great responsibility. Comes power, and we have to use the admin user to be able to do a monitoring. So this is why I kind of was like, that's why I was kind of like a reference there. I have a couple of those kind of buried throughout here. And we've got our little Mogwai friend here. And kind of like similar to our Mogwai friend, he only has a couple rules. You don't want to keep him up after midnight, and you don't want to feed him up after midnight. And you don't want to get him wet either. So, so this is kind of like the rules for writing communication method for talking to Nagios server. And basically, you just have to do a couple things here. You have to set a return code, and you have to tell it some state information. So in most cases, hopefully things are happening and things are working correctly. You're going to be setting an OK. If something comes back and you analyze it from the database and you've got some state information you want to communicate to Nagios to tell if things are wrong, this is where these things start coming into play. I've been using actually a known now a little bit more, mostly for if there's a communication problem with SQL where it can't talk and communicate to the database correctly. Something goes on, it can't execute a command correctly within a certain time frame. So, and again, you want to not just know that there's a problem, but what to do about it. So in most cases, if things are okay, I just say okay, and if not, you could have anything you really want to in this box that comes back and this gets displayed in Nagios, but this is the pieces, this is what gets communicated, I think, also to the pager as well. So you can have that be as dumb or as intelligent as you want it to be based on the rules in the network. Okay, so to kind of get a little more into the active side, we've kind of gone over passive now, is that in order to use NRPE, in conjunction with the in conjunction with the nz.sql package, you have to do some configuration of NRPE, which allows it to use the Netezza user and group. And one possible option there is to use sudo, which I didn't choose, so I don't know how that could have possibly worked. So, but that's another option. So once a script is written, it should be tested. It must be tested, and it's always a good idea to test the SQL to make sure that it functions correctly and that you know what kind of return counts that you're getting. So for each sensor must be associated with the command line. So you can see here, oops, sorry about that. So you can see here this line here that this is a line that could set in your NRPE that allows the Nagios server to actually execute that command through the NRPE architecture. So I'm exposing a script and then telling Nagios how to call it on the Nagios side. So for the best practice is to work with your sysadmin for Netezza server and make the group on the file nrpe.config open for the NZ user, for read at least, and optimally it would be read and write. Okay, so we've got what happens on the Netezza side. Let's flip over to what happens on the Nagios server side. So we've got only one-time command that needs to be entered here, and this is anytime you communicate with NRPE, this would need to be added to your configuration files. So it's just a one-time thing, and then once you're past that, every time you add a service, you would add a command in your services file that allows it to talk to that actual command. So you can see here that NRPE is the method being used to communicate. And again, here this might look a little bit familiar. You've got check NZ long query. That's what you've exposed on the database side in order to make that thing communicate correctly. You'll see here there's no extra parameters. Again, that's why we're not using that extra parameters. Okay, so this dives a little bit more into using the SQL.pm package. So you've got here just some general things that you need to do, some rules about how to make it work correctly. So the package is located in nzkit share Perl. So you have to use a live command in Perl in order to be able to access that library. And then once you use it, you have to actually use the use command in Perl. And general rule is that you have to connect to the database. This is kind of fairly useful if you want to talk to the database. And just two things you need to know is where your kit directory is and where your data directory is, which should be fairly simple if you've got either admin or DBA on the database. Okay, best practice I found was use alarm timers around SQL execution. I've been using about 60 seconds, and this ties back to the unknown state that I was talking about in the previous slide, is that if it goes past that 60 seconds, basically what happens is I tell Nagios it's an unknown state, and then it displays that back up on the website and alerts on it if people are interested in looking at unknown states, which generally are not. Okay, so some handy variables, oops. So some handy variables that come back. Why do I keep on doing that? After you've done a SQL execution is nrows and cols, call ID and qtype. Nrows, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important variable here, and I'll get into why. Okay, and after you've actually got connection to the database, you've got to tell it what you want to run and which database you want to talk to. In most cases, most of my queries are dictionary related, so I mostly just connect to system and stay there, or talk to the system database. You don't need to connect to the system database. So unlike DBI, a database must be called out in every single time you run a query. And result sets are not active in the database, unlike most of the SQL Server or Oracle or something like that when you're using Perl and DBI. So the result set, in order to make this correctly, is the result set is cached in a Perl data structure in order similar to the nrows variable, except you have to access it using a for each command in Perl. So you have to roll through that structure and analyze it, and if you want to analyze some state coming back from your result set, you look through it and then you act on it. What I found is the best practice is you skip for each completely and just rely on nrows only. If you're, for example, if you're looking for a state of the disks, you want to say, find me all the bad disks, and if it's more than one, then guess what? I've got a problem. And I tell Nagios, and it displays it. Okay, so some future directions for the tool is data graphing. I haven't touched that at all. I kind of have to admit this is probably one of the weakest areas I have for myself as to how Nagios does data graphing, but this is something I'd like to expand into. And also expand areas that we're currently monitoring for Netezza. Integrate into a current product offering that we have for my company, Brightlight, which is Observation Deck, which allows you to collect NZ hist and roll up and look at it. And also predict where we're going to look at our processing database needs. And I don't know if any of you are getting this reference here. Who's going to make the Back to the Future? All right. All right. All right, we won't get in that one. All right, so conclusion, key takeaways are using Nagios can help your company have an extensible event monitor. I'm using Core in this case, so it's not only extensible, but it's free. Understanding Nagios architecture is important to a stable and working monitoring setup. Once you understand architecture setup, writing an agent is very trivial. You just have to be able to write SQL. I've got some other reading materials throughout this presentation, which are URLs, which tell you how to set up. And if you have any questions.
Comments for Frank?
And I've got references here at the end here if you're interested in where I got some of my facts. And that's all. Thank you for your time.